Welcome to The Debate. What if I told you that the architect of modern relativity, Albert Einstein, and a first-century mystic meditating in total isolation in the desert somehow arrived at the exact same conclusion about the fundamental structure of the universe?
I mean, I'd say that sounds like a pretty massive stretch.
Right, it really does. But, in evolutionary biology, there is this fascinating mechanism known as convergent evolution. It is the process where completely unrelated organisms independently evolve the exact same physical structures to solve a problem.
Like the eye, right?
Exactly, the camera-like eye. It evolved entirely separately in humans and in octopuses, two vastly different evolutionary paths, completely isolated from one another, arriving at the exact same mechanism to perceive the light of the world.
Right. And the reason that happens in biology is because the physical laws governing light and optics are universal. I mean, the environment dictates the solution. If you want to see, there are really only so many ways to bend light through a lens.
Yes, precisely. And when you step into the realms of human consciousness, philosophy, and modern physics, we encounter a conceptual convergent evolution that I think is, well, frankly, staggering. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of reality that historically has been really murky and deeply fragmented. Yet, across completely different eras, cultures, and languages, independent minds have arrived at the exact same conclusion.
Which brings us to the actual focus of our discussion today.
Right. The central premise raised by our source material today, the document One Reality, Many Names, and Joe Bondra's philosophical exploration, Finding Nyaya, they propose that diverse mystics and modern quantum physicists have independently encountered the exact same undivided fundamental reality.
Yeah.
And furthermore, this proposition asserts that institutionalized religion has systematically distorted this direct experience for its own ends.
So I read those same texts, obviously, but I think we have to be incredibly careful here. It is tempting to look at a Zen master in the 12th century and a quantum physicist in the 20th century and declare they're, saying the exact same thing.
But they are.
Well, in my view, it is the absolute definition of a massive conceptual leap.
Okay, well, my stance today is that this historical and geographic convergence is absolutely no coincidence. I'll argue that disparate traditions and modern physics empirically converge on a shared, fundamental, undivided awareness, and that institutions deliberately suppress this to maintain control.
And, I come at it from a different way. I will argue that conflating these vastly different observations into a single universal truth ignores profound methodological differences, and ironically, it risks creating the very type of rigid dogma the text itself is trying to critique.
Let me begin by laying out the sheer weight of this convergence, because we are talking about an unbroken thread of realization that spans millennia.
Okay, let's hear it.
When you read Lao Tzu describing the Tao, you are hearing about a silent, indivisible ground of being. When you look at Nagarjuna in the Buddhist tradition, he articulates shunyata, or emptiness.
Right.
And fast forward centuries, you have the 20th century physicist David Bohm formulating the implicate order. The core insight remains identical across these massive gulfs of time and methodology. The world of separate selves and separate objects is not the ultimate reality. Subject and object arise from a deeper unity.
Wait, let's pause there for a second, because a word like emptiness sounds incredibly bleak to a modern ear.
Sure.
I mean, it sounds like a black void of nothingness. You don't mean nihilism here, do you?
No, not at all, and I'm really glad you brought that up. Nagarjuna explicitly taught that emptiness is not a void. It is the realization of interdependent arising.
Okay.
Think of it like an ocean and a wave. You cannot isolate a single wave and say, this wave exists entirely on its own, independent of the water. The wave is just a temporary behavior of the ocean. So emptiness just means empty of independent existence.
Right, it relies on the whole.
Exactly. And when we look at David Bohm's implicate order in quantum physics, he was describing the exact same structural reality. He used the analogy of a hologram.
I love that analogy.
It's perfect, right? If you take a holographic photograph of an apple and you cut the photographic plate in half, you don't get half an apple, you get the whole apple, just slightly fuzzier. The whole is enfolded into every single part.
Look, it is a beautiful aesthetic resonance. I'll give you that. When you read these texts side by side, the poetry is undeniable.
It's more than poetry.
But is it? We must seriously question the intellectual rigor of this perennial philosophy approach, declaring that Buddhism, Abrahamic mysticism, and modern quantum physics are all describing the exact same reality is a sweeping generalization.
How so?
Because it strips each of its vital, specific context. The text itself makes a crucial concession. The methods of science and spirituality remain profoundly different.
Of course the methods are different.
Right, but physics is a quantitative measurement of the material world. Mysticism is a qualitative, subjective experience of consciousness. By collapsing them into one another, I think we are doing a huge disservice to both.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the empirical nature of this synthesis. We can no longer dismiss this as mere poetic similarity when the hard sciences are arriving at the same conclusions through rigorous mathematical testing.
Okay, let's look at the science then.
Let's look closely at the physics parallel. Albert Einstein himself described the human feeling of separateness as a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. That it's not a mystic speaking, that is the architect of modern relativity.
True.
And as quantum theory developed, it literally shattered the Newtonian image of a universe made of independently existing solid billiard ball-like objects.
But wait, how does shattering the Newtonian universe automatically equal undivided spiritual awareness? Those are two huge leaps.
Because at the quantum level, matter dissolves into probabilities. Until a particle is measured or observed, it exists in a state of superposition, a wave of potential outcomes.
Right, the wave function.
Exactly. And the moment an observer interacts with it, that wave function collapses into a distinct particle. What this tells us, mechanically, is that the observer and the observed are completely inseparable.
I'm following you.
Science is fundamentally verifying what mystics experienced intuitively, that the separate self looking at a separate object is an illusion. They are secondary phenomena emerging from a unified field.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual physical mechanics of what quantum physicists are saying?
What do you mean?
You are drawing a direct line between the dissolution of matter in physics and the dissolution of the ego in mysticism, but those are completely different categories of phenomena. Let me counter with another physicist cited in the text, Werner Heisenberg.
Okay.
He famously recognized this strange shift in science, but note his exact words. He wrote, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning."
Which perfectly supports the idea that the separate objects we think we see are just artifacts of our observation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that interpretation at all. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
Heisenberg is not saying that underneath our observation lies some mystical unified awareness. He is outlining a strict epistemological limit. Let's look at how the uncertainty principle actually works in a lab. Sure, if you want to see an electron, you have to bounce a photon of light off of it. But a photon has momentum, so the very act of bouncing light off the electron to measure where it is fundamentally changes how fast the electron is moving.
Because you interacted with it.
Exactly. You cannot measure a particle without physically interacting with it and therefore altering its state. Heisenberg is saying that physics isn't proving a singular objective reality of oneness. Rather, it is revealing the inescapable limits of human observation.
I think that's a very rigid reading.
But it's what the math says. You aren't pointing to the Tao or Brahman or God. You are pointing to the boundary of your own measuring tools. I feel like you are using quantum physics as a new, secular, ultimate truth to retroactively validate ancient mysticism.
That is an interesting point, though. I would absolutely frame it differently. I don't think using physics is an attempt to validate mysticism at all.
No?
No. Rather, they're two independent vectors converging on the same coordinate. Mysticism explores the internal subjective coordinate. Physics explores the external objective coordinate.
Okay.
When Heisenberg says we only see nature exposed to our method of questioning, he is confirming Nagarjuna's concept of interdependent arising mechanically. You cannot isolate a single thing from the whole without fundamentally altering or falsifying it.
But the why matters here. Interdependent arising in Buddhism is an ethical and psychological framework. Why did Nagarjuna teach it?
To awaken people.
to reduce human suffering by dismantling the ego's attachment to things. The quantum field, on the other hand, is a mathematical framework predicting the behavior of subatomic particles.
Right, but
To say they describe the same reality ignores the fact that quantum mechanics has absolutely nothing to say about human suffering, compassion, or the ego.
they don't have to share a moral framework to be describing the exact same ontological ground, though. The fact that reality at its base is undivided is a structural truth.
Okay, so if the math of quantum physics and the texts of ancient mystics are actually pointing to the exact same truth, that there is no ultimate division between self and other, why is it that when you walk into a church today, you hear about eternal damnation, sinners and saints, heaven and hell?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. How did that message get so completely inverted?
Because human history has been entirely about building borders and walls to manage power. If the fundamental nature of reality is undivided, then any institution built on strict division, priest and sinner, saved and damned, is operating in direct opposition to that reality.
That's quite an indictment.
History shows that institutions do not just politely disagree with mystics. They act with violent hostility toward direct experience.
Violent hostility feels like a very strong accusation against the entire history of organized religion, don't you think?
But the mechanism of that hostility is completely logical when you look at it through the lens of power. Direct experience completely removes the need for intermediaries.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
A person who directly encounters the sacred no longer depends on priests, doctrines, or the church apparatus. Let me give you a very specific example from the text. The Sufi mystic Mansur al-Hallaj.
Yes.
He experienced the dissolution of the separate self into divine unity and declared, "I am the truth." He was speaking from a state of non-duality. He realized the wave was the ocean.
Right. The classic mystical realization.
But how did the religious authorities respond? They interpreted it literally, perceived it as a direct threat to their monopoly on truth, and executed him for blasphemy.
It's a tragic story, yes.
The mystic speaks from non-duality. The institution hears a threat to its political power. We see the exact same pattern with the origins of Christianity. Jesus Christ repeatedly spoke about the kingdom of God being within. It was a message of inner transformation. Yet centuries later, institutional religion deliberately rewrote that focus, replacing it with obedience, external salvation, and a fear-based theology designed to preserve a hierarchy.
I understand the appeal of that narrative, I really do. It cleanly frames the mystic as the pure, enlightened rebel, and the institution as the corrupt, power-hungry villain.
Because it historically happens over and over.
But the text itself provides a much more nuanced view. It explicitly states that this is rarely deliberate deception. We have to look at the actual mechanics of how human systems operate over time.
So you are saying the execution of al-Hallaj was just, an administrative error?
Not an error, but a reaction driven by something much deeper than just cynical politics. It is driven by fundamental human neurology and psychology. Let me offer a different analogy.
Okay.
Think of trying to transmit this deep, ineffable, mystical experience like trying to write an instruction manual for falling in love.
That sounds impossible.
Exactly. You can write down all the biological symptoms, rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, sweaty palms, but the manual is not the feeling.
Right.
If you hand that manual to your children and they hand it to their children, eventually the feeling gets lost and people just start worshiping the manual. Worse, they start punishing anyone whose pupils don't dilate the right way.
But that is exactly my point. The map replaces the territory, and the institutions actively enforce the map.
Yes, but not necessarily out of malice. Why do people worship the manual? Because the human brain is essentially a prediction machine that evolves to keep us alive.
Sure, biology plays a part.
A huge part. The unknown, the silent, infinite mystery that the mystics talk about is neurologically terrifying to the average person. The brain craves certainty, because certainty means survival.
Okay, I'll grant you that the brain wants safety.
Right. If there is no separate self, there is no ego to protect, and our brains are hardwired to protect the ego at all costs. When teachings about awakening gradually become systems of reward and punishment, it is because fear is a highly effective evolutionary tool for social cohesion.
But that doesn't excuse the suppression.
I'm not saying it excuses it, but to say that religious authorities just cynically sat in a room and decided to rewrite Jesus' teachings to invent a fear-based theology is historically reductive. They were trying to organize complex, chaotic human societies using the only tools available, dogma and law. The distortion is an inevitable psychological byproduct of translating the infinite into the finite.
Well, I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the outcome on the ground is indistinguishable from deliberate suppression.
Indistinguishable?
Yes. Whether it is an unconscious neurological drift towards certainty or a conscious political power grab, the result is the same. The original liberating insight is buried, and the institutions actively patrol the borders of their maps.
They maintain order?
When someone like Al-Hallaj or Meister Eckhart points back to the territory, the system eliminates them. That is an active defensive mechanism of a system protecting its authority. Institutions completely rely on the division between the sacred and the profane to justify their own existence.
Well,
If everything is the Tao, if everything is the implicate order, then the institution is entirely obsolete.
It is not obsolete for the vast majority of people who cannot simply meditate their way into a state of permanent non-dual awareness while trying to raise children and harvest crops. The structure provides a necessary container for society.
A container that often becomes a cage.
But this brings us to a massive problem with this entire premise, and specifically with Joe Bandra's work in Finding Nia.
What's the problem?
If writing the instruction manual inevitably destroys the experience of falling in love, how can Bandra, or you, propose this new framework without it immediately becoming just another manual?
Oh, that is the exact paradox Bandra addresses. His central insight in Finding Navia is crucial here, because it actively attempts to bypass the trap of institutional doctrine.
How does he manage that?
He writes that truth cannot ultimately be borrowed from scripture, ideology, or even quantum physics. It must be encountered directly. His focus is on the mechanism of the mind before thought divides existence.
Before thought.
Yes. Before your brain creates the categories of self and world, there is only undivided awareness. Returning to this state is not about adopting a new theology. It is an active unlearning.
An unlearning.
Exactly. You are not adding a new belief system to your mind. You are stripping away the conceptual labels to see what is underneath. It is the ultimate antidote to the fear-based theology of institutions, because it does not ask you to believe anything. It asks you to observe the nature of your own mind before it fragments reality.
But, by naming it undivided awareness, by framing it as the ultimate antidote, Bandra's doing exactly what he criticizes.
I don't see it that way.
Let me invoke Lao Tzu's ancient warning from the very beginning of the source material. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao.
Right, a classic paradox.
It's more than a paradox. It's a fundamental limit. The deepest truth can never be fully captured in words because language itself creates division. The moment Bandra or you aggressively categorize this mystery as undivided awareness or equate it with Bohm's implicate order, you are relying on language.
Well, sure, we have to communicate.
But a noun requires a verb. A subject requires an object. Concepts inherently create division. You immediately create a binary between those who understand undivided awareness and those who don't.
That is a linguistic paradox, certainly. We have to use words to tell people that words are insufficient. But pointing toward a reality is not the same as trapping it in a dogma.
It's a slippery slope, though.
The phrase undivided awareness is meant to be self-canceling. Once you experience the water, you drop the word water.
That is exactly what the early Buddhists said about sunyata. Nagarjuna meant for emptiness to be a medicine. If you are sick with attachment, you take the medicine of emptiness.
Exactly.
But once you are cured, you don't keep swallowing the medicine. The concept is supposed to dissolve itself. Yet, look at history. As the text notes, even Buddhism fragmented into sects, dogmas, and bitter philosophical battles over the exact, quote-unquote, correct definition of emptiness.
Human nature gets in the way.
Human nature dictates that the assertion of one reality, even when framed as a purely direct experience, is simply another conceptual framework people will eventually cling to.
By claiming that quantum physics and ancient mysticism all point to this exact same ineffable ground, you are creating a new meta-religion.
I wouldn't go that far.
I would. And just like the institutions you criticize, this new framework will eventually have its own orthodoxies, its own favored texts, and its own way of dismissing those who don't agree with its premise.
Look, I see the risk you are pointing out, but I maintain there is a fundamental difference in the mechanism of how this is applied.
Which is?
Dogmatic institutions demand belief in the absence of experience. They say, believe the manual we have written or you will be punished eternally. The convergence of physics, philosophy, and mysticism we are discussing does the precise opposite. As the text suggests, perhaps the mystics were never saying, believe me. Perhaps they were saying, try this and look for yourself. There is a profound distinction between an institution that demands blind faith and a framework that offers an empirical and contemplative hypothesis to be tested by the individual.
I'll agree that the approach is healthier, certainly.
Despite the inevitable limitations of language, the cross-cultural convergence on a unified ground of being offers a profound, evidence-backed alternative to fragmented belief systems.
Yeah.
The fact that a modern physicist measuring subatomic particles and an ancient Zen master observing his own breath arrive at the same silent, infinite presence beneath the noise of thought is the most compelling evidence we have for a shared reality.
And I maintain that while the invitation to look for yourself is deeply valuable, collapsing rich, distinct, culturally embedded traditions and complex quantum mechanics into a single ineffable ground risks massive intellectual oversimplification.
We just disagree on the scale of that risk, I suppose.
Right. By deciding in advance that all these distinct paths are pointing to the exact same destination, we blind ourselves to the profound, specific insights each tradition offers on its own terms.
We don't have to lose the specifics to appreciate the whole.
But we often do. We lose the rigorous mathematical methodology of science and the rich cultural tapestry of religion, replacing them with a flattened, generic spirituality that sounds good on paper, but lacks the structural integrity of the disciplines it borrows from.
Yet, despite our disagreement on the exact nature of this convergence, I think we both undoubtedly agree on one profound point raised by the text.
Oh, absolutely. The immense danger of mistaking institutional belief systems and literal interpretations for direct encounters with reality.
Exactly. When the instruction manual becomes more important than the experience of love it represents, humanity suffers.
On that, we are in complete convergence. The enduring tragedy of history is watching the living realization harden into rigid doctrine, where mystery is replaced by an artificial certainty designed to manage human anxiety and control populations, rather than liberate them.
Which suggests there is so much more to uncover in the intersections of physics, history, and philosophy, provided we approach them with both intellectual rigor and open curiosity. We have to be willing to look past the labels.
Indeed. The moment we think we have perfectly named the unnameable, we have probably lost it.
So, we return to where we began, looking through the lens of convergent evolution. We are left to ponder, as human beings use the diverse apparatus of mathematics, meditation, and theology to look out into the universe, are we truly seeing the exact same undivided light? Or are we, bound by the rigid limits of our own linguistic and cognitive biology, simply looking at different names for a mystery that will always remain just a few steps beyond our grasp?